During the Trump administration, President Duterte went on a brutal extrajudicial killing spree. He ordered the murder of thousands of people he claimed were suspected drug dealers without any trial, without any due process. Duterte was right in the middle of that campaign of bloodshed when President Trump praised Duterte for what Trump said was an unbelievable job on the drug problem. So, yeah. But Trump gave Duterte more than just praise. He also gave him highly sensitive information about U.S. nuclear submarines off the coast of the Korean Peninsula. According to a transcript of a call between Trump and Duterte in April of 2017, the two leaders were discussing the North Korean nuclear threat when Trump told the Filipino strongman about two active nuclear subs stationed near North Korea. We have two submarines, the best in the world. We have two nuclear submarines. Not that we want to use them at all. I've never seen anything like they are, but we don't have to use this. But Kim Jong-un could be crazy, so we will see what happens. According to BuzzFeed News, defense officials were livid about Trump's disclosure, saying, quite plainly, we never talk about subs. That was the first time we learned that Trump had spilled secrets about nuclear submarines, but it was hardly an isolated incident. That same year, Trump held a high-level meeting to discuss a North Korean missile launch, not in the Situation Room at the White House, but on the outdoor dining terrace at Mar-a-Lago. Trump was dining with the Japanese prime minister when he got the news of the missile launch, and the club was filled with random people who do not have security clearances. And instead of going somewhere private to discuss the missile launch, Trump decided to take the classified briefing with dessert. A Mar-a-Lago club member even posted photos of this classified briefing to Facebook with the caption, "Wow, center of the action." Yep. That same year, Trump hosted the Russian ambassador and the foreign minister at the White House, which would have been controversial enough on its own had we not later learned that President Trump also divulged highly classified information to those two Russian officials as well. Also that year, Trump went on Fox News and appeared to disclose classified information about a previously unknown CIA data breach.
With the CIA, I just want people to know, the CIA was hacked and a lot of things taken. That was during the Obama years. That was not during us. That was during the Obama situation.
All of that took place during Trump's very first year in office. That stuff alone was year one. It did not end there. There was a time Trump tweeted a classified drone photo of an Iranian space facility. There was a time he sat down for an interview with journalist Bob Woodward and ended up revealing the existence of a secret U.S. nuclear program. And there was the now infamous moment when Trump allegedly waved around classified Iran war plans in front of Mark Meadows' biographer while demanding that someone bring him a Coke. And now, today, the New York Times and ABC News are reporting on yet another instance of Trump giving away America's secrets. According to these new reports, after he left office, Trump gave away yet more classified information about America's nuclear subs, this time to an Australian billionaire. The billionaire is a man named Anthony Pratt, who runs one of the world's largest cardboard companies and is a club member at Mar-a-Lago. According to this new reporting, Trump gave Pratt highly sensitive information that could endanger the U.S. nuclear fleet, including the supposed exact number of nuclear warheads U.S. submarines routinely carry and exactly how close they supposedly can get to a Russian submarine without being detected. According to sources who spoke with ABC News, that Australian billionaire then described Trump's remarks to at least 45 others, including 6 journalists, 11 of his company's employees, 10 Australian officials, and 3 former Australian prime ministers. So not a discreet person, this cardboard mogul. Now, NBC News has not independently verified these reports, but it appears the reason we're learning all of this now is because special counsel Jack Smith's team has reportedly interviewed that Australian billionaire, that cardboard mogul, and they have put him on a list of 80 witnesses who could testify in the Mar-a-Lago classified documents trial in May, which raises a whole bunch of questions about the evidence Jack Smith has amassed in this case that we don't even know about yet. Joining me now is former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, Barb McQuade, who also co-hosts the Sisters-in-Law podcast, and Devlin Barrett, justice reporter for The Washington Post and co-author of the Trump Trials newsletter. Devlin, I'm reminded of a piece you wrote in November of last year. The headline has always stuck with me. I think we can pull it up now. Investigators see ego, not money, as Trump's motive on classified papers. I thought of that headline when we learned this news about Trump bragging about nuclear submarines and divulging secret information to random cardboard moguls. How do you see this behavior dovetailing with your thesis?
So I think, to your point, there are examples of this. It's not just one instance. These aren't one-offs. This is a thing he tends to do, which is sort of talk about areas and get into conversations with people that the security professionals, the intelligence officials don't want him to get into. I will say there's one weird silver lining in some of this. And to go back to the point you made about him waving around the Iranian document, as far as we can tell, he often gets significant details wrong here. So one of the, in conversation, I mean, so one of the strange elements of this whole situation is that this incident could obviously be used as evidence of intent and potential harm by Jack Smith in a trial, but it also may not necessarily be chargeable if the information he's relaying to people isn't correct.
It's so ironic that you can actually count on the information somehow being wrong, and therefore it's not as much of a security breach. I do have to ask you, though, I mean, as a reporter, the instances of Trump giving away secrets, I mean, these are just the ones we know of. There were so many in the first year in office. This behavior continues in his post-presidency. It seems like, Devlin, it is impossible for us to truly have a handle on how much he is talking out of turn.
Right. I mean, and you see, you know, so much of his public persona is just sort of, for lack of a better term, riffing. And for someone who gets the presidential daily brief, you know, for years and years, you know, riffing can be quite dangerous or problematic. But that's what he does conversationally. You can see many examples of this. And so obviously there is a significant concern here. And to your point, there are 80 people listed as potential witnesses in this case. You know, you have to think about what are the odds that this particular Australian is the only person who is going to tell a story like this about private conversations with the former president.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Barb. I mean, the fact is we're learning about this person because of Jack Smith, and he has a list 80 people long. We know about some of, we have sort of breadcrumbs, but what is the fact that this anecdote has not been relayed before? It has been kept under wraps. It wasn't in the indictment. What does that tell you about the strength of Jack Smith's case, at least as we can ascertain that from the outside?
Yeah, I think this is just one example of many pieces of evidence that we're going to hear about at the trial that are not currently known. This story that we've heard about from this Australian billionaire sounds to me like the kind of thing that would be offered under a rule of evidence number 404B. And that says that the prosecutor may bring in evidence, even though it does not relate to the charges in the indictment, if it can prove things like intent or modus operandi or absence of a mistake. And so for that purpose, it could be that they want to hear this story from this Australian billionaire and maybe others about the way Donald Trump would be very reckless in handling classified information, because that would tend to prove that he was very reckless in handling the documents with which he is charged.
Can I ask, though, one of the things Jack Smith declined to do was pursue a dissemination charge, Barb. And the fact that he is, whether, you know, with malign intent or not, the fact that he is, in fact, disseminating this information to random, you know, cardboard moguls, why not pursue a dissemination charge if you're Jack Smith and the DOJ?
Yeah, so, you know, prosecutors have to think about, number one, can I file this charge and prevail? And number two, should I file this charge? And so it is absolutely a crime to verbally disclose classified information. And we don't know all the reasons, but I can tell you some things that could be at play here. Number one, when there is an oral communication, it is much more difficult to prove, because you have to prove that what the Australian billionaire heard is accurate, that he's reporting it accurately, and that it was, in fact, classified. And so it may be that Donald Trump was making it up. Maybe he was puffing. Maybe he got the facts wrong, as we heard here. The other thing about it is, if they need to prove that up, they might need to prove up that those facts are true. And if they are classified pieces of information, it may be that the government is more concerned about safeguarding that information than it is about winning any particular count. There were times when I was working as a national security prosecutor, when I had cases or counts I wanted to bring, but the intelligence community put the kibosh on it and said, no, it just isn't worth it because we can't reveal this classified information to the public. So you're just going to have to let this one slide.